will start in 3, 2, 1. We believe that focusing on normal people is the only way to actually get an accurate and inclusive curriculum in schools across the country and around the world. Look, first of all, we need to give you a couple of framing arguments about who the elite and leaders were in these countries. They were largely upper class people who were wealthy and white, and often cis white straight men. These are the people whose stories we are telling when we tell the stories of leaders and politicians and other elite people. There were structural barriers that existed for entry for a lot of marginalized communities, especially women and people of color, throughout all of history. So they were not included in the stories that we tell, but when we tell the stories of leaders, politicians, and upper class elites. These are people that actively oppressed marginalized groups for large sections of history and still do today in the status quo. Telling their stories is telling the story of oppression, and telling any sort of story about people in marginalized communities from the perspective of people who are leaders or upper class is telling a story of oppression through the oppressors. We are never hearing people's voices. We are never hearing them talked about in the way that they want to be talked about. Second, we're going to characterize what these curricula look like. We think that teaching about elite and leaders is the status quo, like as we see in the American public school system. A good example of this is the way that slavery or the American South is taught about in American public schools. All of the stories that we hear are told from the perspective of white people who owned slaves and their reactions to slavery. Even the things that we hear about the abolition movement come from people who are white people who wrote about the movement, but we never hear from this about the Black people who were actively enslaved during that movement. This always teaches from the point of view of the oppressor, never the people that were oppressed. So we never get accurate representation of the voices and the way that other people felt about these things. We think that a curriculum based on ordinary people looks like things like primary sources, like diaries or other sorts of like primary sources that have been passed down through history. We think that this way people are able to have their own voices heard, even though they were being oppressed at the time. And we think that this gives a more accurate view of people's history other than those who are already advantaged by the system. But our first constructive argument here is why we get better education on our side of the house. First of all, we give you a more nuanced understanding of history. We tell you that the people who were in power were very bland. They were very one-dimensional. They were all rich, they were all white, and they were very largely men. We tell you that when we talk about marginalized communities from their own perspectives, we're able to get perspectives that we don't hear otherwise on their side of the house. We hear the perspectives of the people who were being oppressed, of the people who weren't as advantaged, who didn't have the ability to make their voices heard. We are giving them justice by giving them their voices being heard now and allowing them to have a say in the atrocities that were committed against them. We also just think that this is a more complete view of history. We think that prioritizing having a more complete view of history is good at the point where people learn from the mistakes of the past and see these things and can generalize them and relate them to the society that we live in today. We think it's extremely important that people be able to see a complete view of the past and not just part of the view of the past that's like dictating and propaganda based on what white people wanted them to see. We think that this is really damaging. But look, we think that this impacts pretty heavily on marginalized groups who now actually feel safe in spaces where history is being taught. I think that in the status quo, a lot of people feel very unsafe in these spaces because they feel that their voices have been ignored for generations, and they see that their voices are still continually being ignored now. We think that this is horrible for them, but we also think that this compounds over years as people don't learn about marginalized groups, and the only people that take the time to learn about them are people who are already a part of that group. We think that this breeds cultural misunderstandings as people don't learn about each other and don't take the time to. We think that this starts off very, very young in literally like kindergarten classes, and we think it just continues on from there. People never learn to be empathetic towards other people. We think that in a world where we have more emphasis on learning about normal, average, everyday people, more people are able to relate to that, and more people are able to see themselves in the history that is being taught and actually relate to that. But a little bit of comparative here. I think that both sides of the debate actually study the same events in history class. It's just the perspective from which those events are taught that we care about the most. Because on our side of the house, we get a perspective of those events that's more complete. We're not saying you can never learn about a leader, and I think that Op is probably going to try to tell you that. We're not saying you can never learn about the politics or the leaders of a country, but what we are saying is that that's not the perspective from which history should be taught. We can talk about those leaders, and we can talk about the actions that they did and how they contributed to the global political scheme, the global political order, but we need to talk about them from the perspective of people who their actions affected and how those actions played out in the world. We think that this shows a better understanding of what those actions actually looked like and what that history even was in the first place. Also, we tell you that getting more marginalized people interested in history changes the field in the long term. This is the tipping point because people feel really alienated in the status quo. They never want to actually enter into the historical fields because they feel that it excludes them and that their voice isn't going to be heard. When people are in history learning about marginalized communities, and like a woman in history class learning about how women in history were treated, it makes her want to study those things, and it makes her feel like she is able to access into that field. This diversifies the field, getting rid of some of the sexism and racism that we see in it and the status quo. But our second argument here is why we get better societal change for marginalized groups by doing this. Look, people empathize more when they see the actual history that happened and they don't just see it from the perspective of people who didn't have empathy. These historical leaders and politicians had no regard for the marginalized communities that they terrorized during their reigns. But when people see this perspective, they think that this is okay, it's normalized. This is especially bad at the point where white people in history classes see these actions that have been taken, and even if their teacher says this is bad, they don't actually internalize this as being bad because there's no reason for them to think it was bad. We're glorifying these leaders and saying, look at this cool leader, he did this cool thing. But then they're like, oh, also he was bad, he had slaves. But no one internalizes these things. It's the same reason people still think Andrew Jackson is a super cool guy, because they hear about him as this leader figure and they think he's great. But look, also on op, we tell you that on side op, the only people that are actually going to learn about the history of marginalized groups are people who are themselves marginalized already. This puts the burden onto them to do all of the extra work to find out about themselves and find out about the things that they care about. This makes it really hard for them to ever meaningfully engage with this and further others them. When people see the struggles a group has faced, they're way more likely to work with them, way more likely to create positive societal change at the point where people cross-apply historical narratives that they see into movements that are happening today. The same way people compare like the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to this current protests today. We think that people need to see the struggles that a group has faced throughout history so that they're more likely to actually want to work with them and create these cross-ethnic bridges and like work with each other. But also some way in here, we think that the most important thing in this round is who actually gets positive change for currently oppressed groups. I think we give you a pretty clear mechanism by which we do that, because a curriculum based on elites and leaders will never actually create solvency for the problems that marginalized groups face today. Why? First of all, it feeds into itself year after year after year. But second of all, marginalized communities literally cannot engage with this. This happens over generations as the system continually pushes marginalized communities out. They lose faith in the system. They don't get into academia. This is the same reason that the current academic system is so rich and so white right now, and people are unable to meaningfully partake in it. Clearly, continuing with what we're doing in the status quo isn't working. So on our side of the house, we propose a positive change. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much to Prime Minister for that fine speech. We are ready to call Leader of the Opposition to continue.
Is everyone ready? Okay, then I'll start. Start with some framing about what the most important issue in this round is. We would contend that history curricula is about providing perspective to avoid repeating past failures of human society and to create an accepting mindset towards people outside of a history student's cultural bubble. With that in mind, let's talk about the opening government first. They make a problematic or like an incorrect assumption about the motion. The motion reads, this House believes that history curricula should be structured around lives of ordinary individuals as opposed to leaders, icons, politicians, and the elite. They only focus on one aspect of this motion, which is the fundamental error of the speech, which is they only focus on the elites, who are probably white and cisgender. However, you can consider the fact that oppressed people also have leaders, right? For example, think of MLK, think of Gandhi, think of Harriet Tubman, think of Helen Keller. All of these people spearheaded the rights of oppressed groups and demonstrated that these should matter in the context of the history curricula. So it is not as though this curriculum is just about elites and white people, but rather we should look to the fact that it also includes leaders of oppressed groups or marginalized groups. Furthermore, and this will be more on the off case about how understanding how individuals are capable of evil in positions of power is really important from preventing future failures. I will talk about that later, but that's also a reason why we should look to leaders. An example of this is the example they give you themselves about Andrew Jackson. We learn about Andrew Jackson not as a great individual. We learn about the Trail of Tears in US history, and we understand the terrible things he's done to Native Americans. And based on that, we understand that like future leaders should not do those atrocities. And we understand that as a result of the guilt or the problems that these leaders enacted, that we must correct these in a reparative manner. Okay, off case. The main argument I'm going to be going for is that we need to critically analyze the actions of leaders because the analysis of the action of leaders is fundamentally intertwined with the power structures that have led to abuses throughout history. Oftentimes, elites are often, as they say, and we agree, perpetrate major abuses throughout history. We say this is likely because they are in positions of power and entitlement and feel like they can take advantage of their standing in society. However, the comparative is clear. If you focus on the ordinary lives of individuals, that doesn't mean that you are looking at power structures the whole time, because ordinary people do ordinary things that are not always about oppression. For example, if you're looking at the ordinary lives of people, you'd probably have to look into, for example, like the types of food they ate, or the types of clothes they wore, or the social relationships they had. These things will actually dilute the curriculum such that you aren't focusing as much time on power structures, and instead you're looking at ordinary lifestyle things. I would contend that focusing on leaders is fundamentally important to preventing oppressive practices in the future because you are focusing on the power structures that existed. Examples of this include, e.g., business leaders doing oppressive practices, like, for example, Andrew Carnegie hiring scabs to prevent unions from doing things. We understand, based off of this historical understanding, that we should protect unions and actually prevent monopolies from existing. Another example is legislative leaders enacting racist laws. Then we know that we should probably elect leaders that are not racist so that our leaders do not do bad things in the future. What are the impacts? First, we think that understanding how leaders ought to be and having this comparative of good leaders, leaders of oppressed groups, people who have actually done good things, and having the comparison with leaders who have enacted oppressive practices allows us to actually vote for leaders that are not like the ones in history that are so terrible. We would contend that insofar as leaders have the highest amount of influence in society, we should have the highest amount of knowledge about how to accurately choose leaders. With that, I'll take a POI.
What do you think is more important in understanding the depths of evil? Understanding how Andrew Jackson felt when he was crafting the Trail of Tears, or what it was like to be a poor Native American woman having to walk it and watching her kids die along the way?
Okay, so yes, both exist, but I would contend that if you are talking about just Native Americans, rather than considering Andrew Jackson and the terrible things that he did, which caused the suffering to ordinary people, you'd also just be looking at the types of plants they ate, or the things they did throughout their day, rather than considering the power structures. And I would contend that those things are really bad, and we do need to focus on them, but the majority of the time in the curriculum will be spent on focusing on those things if you are looking at leaders rather than just the ordinary lifestyles of individuals. I would contend that time is probably the most important argument in this round. The side that proves that the history curricula that we implement, focusing on leaders or focusing on ordinary people, focuses more time on considering oppressive practices and how to prevent them in the future, is probably the side that's going to win this round. And I would contend that is our side because leaders fundamentally are always interacting with these power structures and are the ones that are interacting with these oppressive structures. They make it sound like we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson in a positive light, but that is not the case. I would contend that increasingly in the United States, that's just a very unpopular opinion. That's why we're considering taking him off the $20 bill. But I would contend that if anything, we are not looking at oppressive actors as great people, because teachers aren't that stupid. They know that they should critically analyze the oppressive practices of these people and actually make it so that people understand that we should not elect individuals that have similarities with past oppressive figures. The second point I want to make really quick is that you also get a more granular understanding of history, especially from a global perspective. I would contend that it would be very difficult to understand the breadth of Chinese history without the understanding of like the Sun Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty or the Qin Dynasty, and without understanding that there are differences throughout history that has progressed culturally, you don't get a granular understanding of the different like philosophical ideologies that have come out of different countries. Without this granular understanding, this provides room for broad generalizations rather than understanding that countries can change throughout history and are more evolutionary.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We are ready to call DPM to respond. Here.
You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, my bad. All right, I'll restart.
That's what I said, 3, 2, 1 to check.
Yeah.
Go on.
All right, cool. 3, 2, 1. I think it's rather a shame that side opening opposition doesn't actually engage with the comparative that Katrina provides to you within their speech. What does this actually look like, and how is this going to actually occur within educational curricula? The comparative is that you are not changing the specific events that you are going to be studying. That is to say, on our side of the house, you are not going to be studying ordinary individuals cooking beef stew. You are still going to be studying things like, for example, slavery. You are still going to study things like the 30 Years' War and the American Revolution. What categorically changes here is the perspective and lens by which you ultimately study it. On their side of the house, you are studying it through the lens of individuals like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, for example. While on our side of the house, you are studying it through the oppressed African-American groups who, for example, had to fight in the war and were forced to do so, or individuals who had diaries during the transatlantic slave trade and had unique perspectives that are not included in the curriculum today. The reason that this matters incredibly heavy within the debate and the weighing behind this is clear. On their side of the house, even if it is the case that you still study events like slavery, you do not provide a more nuanced understanding of it from the individuals who dealt with the actual pain of those struggles themselves. And the key difference here is that on our side of the house, you also have real world impacts in today's world, where individuals of marginalized community status can ultimately go into their history class and feel far more comfortable at the end of the day and not have to deal with those types of pressures. Before I move on, I will take a POI from CO.
I am just confused about this assumption on OG. So when I learn Chinese history, the history of the elites in ancient China is not a history of white people, and it's often a history of women. So why should I not be learning about them?
Because here's the categorical difference, because you have to recognize the greater nuances that even if you are studying, for example, elite women, you are not studying the oppressed women on the ground, because there were still individuals who were incredibly low income in China at those times, who have their own primary sources available, who never get studied on your side of the house. So even if you do expand it to a greater international level, we get you a better amount of study on our side of the house from the individuals who did have to face difficulties and who are on the wrong side of it, like on the difficult side of oppression. That being said, I'm going to move first on some refutation from what you get coming out of opening opposition, and then a couple questions that I want to crystallize within round and weigh heavily. First, they talk to you about how it is the case that elites are intertwined with oppression. And they talk to you about how it is the case that when you study ordinary individuals, you have to study ordinary things. I think you can cross-apply my framing here, but I think what you have to recognize is what this actually ends up looking like. Because on their side of the house, the Andrew Jackson example is that when you study things like the Trail of Tears, the narrative that you are taught in American schools right now is that the Trail of Tears was a product of a Supreme Court case got wrong. You never actually study it from the perspective of the fact that America had terrible racist narratives, and individuals to this day still think that Andrew Jackson is a good individual. Think about the fact that when people were going to take Andrew Jackson off the $20 bill, there was a huge amount of uprising against it from conservative individuals. These types of examples show that there are incorrect assumptions about a lot of the elites and oppressors throughout history that at the end of the day are propagated by our educational system. And I think you just cross-apply the framing because I simply don't think that opening opposition actually engages with the comparative. They talk to you about how it is also the case that you ought to understand how leaders ought to be. I think what you have to recognize here, however, is that you get a better better understanding of how leaders ought to be on our side of the house, when at the end of the day, we are studying it through the perspective of individuals who are actually being led by those leaders. The way that this actually ends up looking like is pretty clear. On their side of the house, when you study about individuals like, for example, Andrew Jackson or whatever the case may be, what ends up occurring is you have individuals who are being taught through what they wanted to put in. That is, you look about Andrew Jackson policies, but you never actually understand how leaders ought to be in terms of the impact on the people on the ground, because that's at the end of the day how you actually understand whether a leader is good or not as to how they are impacting other individuals. But you don't have access to these primary sources on their side of the house. Also, to address this weird characterization that you get from opening opposition about how like you can have leaders like MLK or Gandhi at the end of the day, I think what you have to recognize is the clear comparative, because even if these individuals are leaders of marginalized communities, there are also leaders who are oftentimes in much more greater power. So the Gandhi example, for example, you have Gandhi as like the leader of his own like resistance group, but you also have leaders at the top of the British Raj who are also studied within history on a day-to-day basis. On our side of the house, when you structure greater signings, you study things like the widespread civil rights movement. You don't just study MLK, but you also study other individuals who are at things like, for example, Selma marches, who are better understood on our side of the house than in comparison on their side of the house. So even on marginalized community leaders, we get more nuanced understanding because we get a greater and more broad perspective for what the average everyday individual was actually look like. But then they talk to you about how you get a more broad perspective and how you have different philosophical ideas. I think that the response here is pretty clear, and I think that the weighing here is pretty clear. Even if you have good understandings of broad philosophical ideas on their side of the house, it's deeply unclear how you actually get this applied. And it's quite nebulous throughout the opening opposition discussion as to how exactly these philosophical ideas come into play with the individuals who matter most. Because here's the newsflash. When people are making things like, for example, philosophical ideas about democracy, it's applied to people on the ground. The reason we care about democracy is not because there is elected leaders, but because we care about how we govern the average everyday individual. That's how you get it better on our side of the house, because we give you that type of nuanced perspective. But moving on to the crystallizing questions in the round, I think first is the question of who gets you better and more nuanced education. What's the story that we provide to you? The story that we provide to you is that you have a broad perspective of history, because on our side of the house, we have a clear, better understanding of the average everyday individual. Even when it comes to, for example, non-US history, you're talking about things like European history or Chinese history, there is oftentimes mass amounts of inequalities. What this really means, however, is that the individuals who are ordinary are oftentimes oppressed at the end of the day. The ordinary individuals in Egypt had a high likelihood to be slaves, for example. They weren't pharaohs, but the key difference is on their side of the house, that's what you end up studying. The responses and the engagement that you end up getting from side opening and opposition simply don't actually teach you that much, because they tell you that, look, we still learn about a lot of these atrocities. This doesn't address the characterization we provide you, and I think I've already done this. But I think that the weighing here and why you care about this the most within the round, and that's why you sign your opening government ballot here, is because it's applied to kids within their formative years. Because this isn't simply, for example, 50-year-old men learning about this history. These are kids who are in their 10s and ultimately growing up during their formative years, and the educational system is something that they are oftentimes interacting with on a day-to-day level. When they begin to learn more about this history, it conditions them in such a way where it becomes highly cyclical in their mind that this is the perspective of history that is oftentimes taught to them. Secondarily, on the weighings, that is generally taught from more authoritative perspectives. It's not like they're having conversations with other kids where they can debate it out, but they have a 30 or 40-year-old teacher telling them that this is what history is. When that is the case, kids begin to have these really unnuanced perspectives about history that end up hurting them in the long run when they are trying to apply this history onto things like, for example, the George Floyd protests and how the 50s and 60s civil rights movement ultimately ended up impacting it, because they learn about it more through the perspective of LBJ than they do about other types of individuals. But I think that that's why you care about this issue the most, because it's impacting the most vulnerable individuals on the ground. But second, I think on the weighing of better education is how it impacts individuals on the ground today, that is marginalized communities today. Because here's what you have to recognize. There is a low amount of mandate and legitimacy for the educational system by a lot of marginalized communities today. Because the simple fact is that they have to go and study history that is just couldn't congruent with their ancestors' story, and they never feel a personal connection. The cyclical weighing here is pretty clear as well, because what you end up getting is a huge cycle which individuals never end up engaging in. And that triggers all of the impacts that Katrina tells you about, how academia is largely rich and white and doesn't offer you these types of nuanced perspectives. But secondarily, this impacts things like societal change, because individuals take their own history and apply it to issues today. That's the top of the opening opposition speech. So you can turn all of their arguments and sign your opening government ballot there. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We are ready to close the debate on a top half, and we would like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue.
3, 2, 1. So let's start off by addressing some of the refutations that the DPM lays out. The biggest conception in this entire debate is that OG is conflating the fact that conflating white hegemony with all forms of leadership that have existed within history. And so with the biggest conflation, the biggest problem in this debate today then becomes is that all of the weighing for the last 2 minutes of the DPM speech was all about comparing their form of advocacy of individual people to the current status quo of white hegemony, about how like kids need to be more informed when they talk about George Floyd, et cetera, et cetera. The resolution does not ask the opening opposition to defend the status quo. We are actively against the status quo. The biggest thing they say is that we do not change the events that we study. inherently the assumption behind the responses in their case is that the events that are studied are not changed, and we completely disagree. We obviously changed the events that are studied because the events that have occurred have happened through a variety of diverse and different perspectives of leaders. If we just have to adopt the status quo of how history is taught by exclusively the white leaders ignoring all other leaders, then obviously that would be an indefensible position. We would be studying things like Nat Turner more frequently in schools because he was a leader. We would be studying Selma more frequently because John Lewis marched on Selma, and as a result, he was a politician and a leader for these minority communities. They keep on making these assumptions that is a binary between Andrew Jackson and Native American women in tears, as the CG would like to point out. But we would be talking about the Native American leaders who were forced to barter with the government and as a result get massively genocided and oppressed. Those leaders are ignored in today's history, and those leaders would be brought into the focus because they are the result of actions by politicians and also individual leaders that create these movements. None of their offense really applies at this point. They talk about how like taking Andrew Jackson off the $20 bill created a massive unrest. It is because of white hegemony. It is not because of a focus on leaders. Their arguments are not linked between a theoretical framework debate of focusing on leaders and politicians versus focusing on individuals. They are trying to have a debate of the status quo is bad, and if we did more of ordinary individuals, then we have offense. That is not debate. I will clearly outline how there are specific theoretical frameworks why focusing on leaders from both sides is better than focusing on ordinary individuals on both sides of today's debate while analyzing these power structures. There are a couple of ways that opening government's case does not interact with the idea that history has been a mechanism for oppression, and understanding those mechanisms is the only way forward for systemically abused minorities. The first sort of development of the off-case argument is that the lives of ordinary individuals are inherently symptoms of a larger institutional problems. This is not to say that it is not possible to use individual lives as a frame of reference for systemic analysis, but rather taking a bottom-up approach to analyzing oppression allows for the introduction of different factors to cloud that assessment of the oppression. The reason why this is true is because for thousands of years, people in systems of power have used things like internalized racism, classism, sexism, and bigotry at large in order to make the minority feel as if they are justified in the way they understand their actions. So by starting on a bottom level approach and then introducing and letting ideas fester that maybe there are other factors other than institutional power mechanisms, by starting from the bottom, you let other factors come in rather than starting from the disease, immediately making a diagnosis and then saying these are also symptoms of the disease, which were these individual actors. We are able to create a clear focus and circumvent the sort of devastating effects of internalized bigotry that has occurred through these power systems and the status quo. Thousands of years of historic coercion has forced us to empathize with factors other than institutional oppression, such as the fact that, for example, Africa's geographic location made it uniquely ripe for exploitation. That's one example of something that we can perceive after first analyzing things on an individual level. So we need to correct that through our curriculum. The second big way that opening government's case will never interact with the mechanisms for understanding oppression better is that ordinary individuals are simply less like studying ordinary individuals is less representative of bureaucratic manipulation, and you become less able to understand the mechanisms of how governments are able to abuse society. For example, we cannot learn about the minutiae of how a prominent congressional leader used archaic Senate rules to establish a pseudo-fascist order, which would permeate American society for decades, by studying the effect of case law on an ordinary individual. There's a disconnect between the impacts of law and the mechanisms that people abuse to enact these laws. I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah, so on your side of the house, you study mechanisms from the source of oppression, while we study mechanisms at the end of those oppressions. That's the comparative. How do you actually engage with that?
So what we study is not solely from the source of the oppression. What we say is that if you do not have a structure that focuses on how these mechanisms were created, you never give minorities the ability to escape their forms of internalized bigotry, and that is a prerequisite. Your assumption is therefore that we do not also consider the perspectives of these minority communities, which I point out is just a false interpretation of the resolution. We do interact with those leaders and those movements and how they've permeated through the status quo because they also have leaders. You do not engage with the theoretical framework of this debate. You honestly fall out of today's debate. Okay, with that in mind, let's go to the third reason why we would say that OG's case doesn't interact with any mechanisms and why uniquely it creates the best form of solvency. Developing countries uniquely have a lack of individual case studies, given that their problems often stem from international institutional changes that don't have the most direct connection to individuals. And what does that sentence actually mean? For example, a lack of representation on the United Nations Security Council doesn't create a direct policy or influence on an ordinary individual in the short term. If it leads to long-term shifts in international norms that exclude the developing world from having a seat at the table, or a lack of opportunity to create discourse, which is representative of how becomes representative of how brown bodies have been silenced for decades of history, it is not something that you can say the average person today has felt that every single day of their life or has been a mechanism for that for all of history. So that also because newly developing domestic institutions may not have had the opportunity to affect individuals in a way that is clearly attributable in the developing world. And as a result, there's debate over whether or not to then attribute harms towards these larger institutions. However, we saw for both of these examples in two different ways. The first is that by directly analyzing the elites and the people who create these power structures, you obviously have to include the fact that, there is not a single developing country in the United Nations Security Council, and as a result, this system of elites has created this effect on this country, and we get unique access to those points of diagnosis and those forms of getting people to create further development. The second is that in domestic institutions, any politician that creates an effectual institution becomes their legacy is something that would obviously be studied, whether or not we can clearly attribute an impact in the short term. This is one of the biggest impacts we say in the round, because we say history is a form of oppression that is clearly subjective. People today will dispute whether or not Jim Crow era laws were good or bad in the most extreme factions of conservatism. But by making it about by making curriculum focus on the subjective effects on individual people, you create leeway for policymakers to then create bad curriculum. But by focusing on elites and power institutions and forcing the debate and forcing discourse on at least those institutions, whether or not they are positive or negative, whether or not they are skewed, you at least create conversation. You create the platform for people to say, this was taught incorrectly. But before, we never have the discourse about any institutions at all, because the metrics are subjective and they don't get incorporated into the curriculum, and we choose individuals to operate. As a result, we create the more holistic approach. All of their way goes out the window. What we say is that we create a history which creates a broad level of mechanisms and creates discourse about how minorities have been oppressed. Historically, this mechanism has not existed. By creating these mechanisms, creating these institutions in those three ways that I've just outlined, we have the most holistic interpretation, and we help minorities in the longest run. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech and to the top half so far. And now we are ready to call the member of the government to open the debate on the closing half.
Okay, so a couple disclaimers. If you want to do POIs, I'm going to have the chat box open the entire time. I would prefer it if you did that. I think it's easier than you guys having to keep your hands up, especially if you guys are trying to take notes. Second of all, I'm going to be using the word great to describe leaders a lot. I don't mean great as in good. I'm not trying to say that at all. I just mean great because it's kind of a short way of just saying like these elite figures, and I think it's like an easier way for me to say it. I've got that written. But I do not mean great as in good. I will kind of establish when I mean good type of things first. I don't want anybody to get that misconception. When I'm talking about like a slave owner, I mean good. Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So I'm gonna jump right into rebuttal, and then I'm gonna do some commentary on like what I think the top app kind of misses, and then I'm gonna go into like our substantives and like how we really extend out this round and mechanize a lot of the good material that OG, or mechanize and impact a lot of the good material that OG lays down for us as a basis, right? So I think the first thing we need to rebut here is that you think like to deal with OO's case, you still learn about quote unquote meaningless things, i.e. educational practices, or like what the individuals looked like, or what the people ate. It's just now it's just centered in like leaders and elite. We don't see how this is exclusive. The LO did zero work on why this is exclusive in the past. And we also agree with OG that we're still focused on like important like historical events. We don't think it's fair for opposition bench entirety to like box us into this idea that we're only going to now be focused on like more like irrelevant stuff. I don't want to say irrelevant because I don't think anything is like irrelevant when we're talking about this, but like less important things. We're still going to be important, like spending time on the most important events throughout history, especially as they pertain to like a lot of different people and groups. Second of all, we think ops world actually opens up to more generalizations, and I'll get into this like a little later in my substantives, but because now you prioritize how these great figures viewed the world or these groups, you necessarily don't talk as much about like who these groups actually were and the way they saw themselves. Sure, as they claim, it's a little more subjective, but we think that you still get subjectivity of experience on either side. But in this case, at least we're getting the subjectivity of the people who actually like, you know, lived those lives, not like the journal entries of Andrew Jackson, how they saw the Native Americans. Thirdly, on this creating conversation point that came out of the DLO right at the end. Okay, again, we can still talk about individuals who are normal through diary entries as OG brought up, and to sell like a convincing narrative and just like get a broad-based thing, okay? We think the point is to like diversify the type of individuals that you talk to, so you get a better holistic understanding of the cultural thing. We think you actually get to less conversation because now conversation remains stratified within a relatively small group of people, good leaders or bad leaders or minority leaders, what have you. It still remains stratified within that group. Now, couple comments on OG's case generally, and this kind of sets up our extension, right? We think they do a really good setup. We think they actually, as opposed to like what O was saying, they show why like these minority voices are, even in like with good leaders, are still going to be like intersectional groups are still going to be like worse off, even if you're prioritizing minority leaders like Op says. We think they lack on why educational curriculum specifically is the linchpin given wider social realities and social context that we face in the United States today. We think OG asserts that our side creates a more sympathetic society without telling us specifically how that would be played out. CG, on the other end, is going to tell you why education system is uniquely good for the changing of lensing, why it is exclusively the best, and why it can be used as a mechanism to shape other cultural avenues and lead to more correct representation of history and minority groups in popular culture specifically. And you're going to see a huge amount of impacts come out of that, right? Okay, so first of all, there are so many great avenues for greats to be told, and there's not so many for ordinary people, okay? We think already in society, and like I think this is agreed upon in the entire round so far, that you need a counterweight to fix our country's propensity to only represent the great and powerful, specifically like great and powerful white men, right? We think you need to force it through some avenue, and we think schooling is the best way. Why? Well, we think great figures already have easier stories to tell. They, after all, like did great things and did important things. We think the easier stories to sell, specifically in a capitalist system where people have to pay money to go to a movie theater, right? People want to hear these tales just on the basic fact that they tend to be more action-packed. Note that normal stories are much more difficult to sell. They're individually less action-packed. However, it'd be untruthful to suggest that any great leader could get to his situation without the hard work and individual stories of ordinary people. This fact justifies why school curricula is the single best method to achieve representation. This entire point extends on the OG's idea of why it is important. We think the fact that every single person has to go through this type of schooling is the reason why you get these like stories out to the masses, whereas in like the great stories are going to do this. Note that this deals with the Elo's point that such cultural understanding like needs to be taught in school so you don't like lose this idea of evil. Okay, first of all, like I think my POI like basically threw him for a loop based on his response was completely non-committal about just like, oh, you need time, and I dealt with that in rebuttal. But also I think it's like important to realize that nobody's ever going to stop making movies about the Holocaust, at least for like a very, very long time, right? You're still going to have a lot of cultural avenues to examine the depths and flaws and evils of leaders and horrible people in the past. However, what you will lack often in a capitalist system and the way the media is set up currently is this type of thing that needs to be forced through the school curriculum. I'll take OO.
Given that cultural avenues of information are deeply influenced by white hegemony and often completely ineffective, and the weighing that you gave for why education is important, isn't it important to teach people about power mechanisms through a non-biased, ideally way?
Okay, so first of all, we're going to solve for this in my next third substantive, but also like we don't think there's any such thing as non-biased. You guys self are saying you're lensing everything through the way these elites saw it. You maybe get like a more stratified thing, but it's not like you're not getting this idea of like on non-bias is completely ridiculous. Okay, so we think that you add context to the great figures, and again, this kind of extends off this OG point. You don't always need to glorify figures to be great, and we think showing what it is like to be normal at the time gives us a more sobering idea of how decisions propagate through the society. We think you prevent the deification specifically of the individuals who aren't very good. And why is glorification bad specifically? And this extends off of OG, right? We think glorification of one figure necessarily marginalizes another group, either because they are oppressed or because they just aren't given the shout out they deserve, right? We notice this clashes with OG because to put contributions on a pedestal, you say that the pain and suffering and marginalization of a group associated with such a person matters less. It also marginalizes anyone who helps the rise of those leaders, i.e. African-American women. You heard this out of OG. We think takes OO's best case and shows that it is still lacking, because even if they are deifying like these minority leaders like MLK, you still miss the African-American women who helped his rise to broader civil rights. And we make use of OG's work, but shows that it is a necessity that any type of glorification that happens within the school system currently needs to be wiped out, because you are always marginalizing some sort of likely intersectional group. Thirdly, educational systems promote lives of ordinary people, and it bleeds into the culture. This is how I solve for OO's POI, right? We think people make movies, docs, and books about what they know and what they are inspired by. And everyone has to go through historical curriculum currently, right? We think you set the grounds for culture within society because it shapes the collective knowledge and the collective understanding and ideas that propagate through society. We separate ourselves from OG because they tell us that we need the narratives and it is important for like people to feel heard, but we tell you how there is a wide impact on the rest of the cultural appetite. We think it's very telling that Hidden Figures took 50 years after The Right Stuff, which was about a movie about all white men going to the moon, because they are necessarily like less interesting because it's less action-packed, but they're still just as important, right? Again, extend on OG's point about the formative years, but We on Side give you the massive cultural impact about how this shapes our underlying social reality and what people like want to go to the movies and see, so there's better understanding and of these stories.
Thank you very much. And it's time to include the last team to today's debate, and we would like to invite the member of the opposition to open the case for closing up. Here.
Hi, just a note for POIs. I'll have the chat open so you can send them to me there, but I will also see it more quickly if you like get my attention on the screen somehow. Both are fine. Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there has been a major oversight from GovBench and the entire front half of the debate. We think that generally they are way too America-centric, and we think that even if you take them at their best, all they have proven is that we need to restructure AP US history and AP European history. We think that throughout history, there have been hundreds and thousands of cultures and empires and societies that have had leaders and icons and idols, and also bad leaders who have not been white, who have not been men, and who have not been cisgender. So we think that we think that if we take the entire front half at their best, all they can speak to is American history. We think that that is a major oversight and means that they have not sufficiently proven the motion true. So the second thing I'll do in this speech is that I'll give you some framing for this round that we think is needed. So first, we do agree with everyone else in the debate that learning about oppression is important. And we think that when students learn about oppression and the history of oppression, they're able to use that and apply it in a forward-looking manner to change future systems if they become people who end up being powerful. But also everyone has an influence on other people, so everyone needs to study oppression. So now we think that an analysis of what oppression is and how it appears in history has been missing from the front half of the debate. We think that oppression is a structural thing that operates in an interplay between multiple levels of society and multiple groups within a society. We think that often oppression can be shaped by top-down features. For example, when a new emperor comes in and overtakes a region and therefore imposes different rules. For example, rules about what women can do, or rules about what ethnic minorities are allowed, like what cultural practices they're allowed to have, then that creates conditions of oppression. But oppression doesn't just come from nowhere, right? We also think that the analysis of what oppression is and where it comes from in top half and GovBench is extremely ahistorical, and that's what we think history curriculum is supposed to combat. So now we think that this warrants why we think that when we think that culture changes often in a top-down manner, especially throughout history, where like we've had societies that are like feudal and then therefore look up to emperors and things like the church to decide what norms are acceptable, which means that we can't get a complete understanding of what oppression is, or what even social dynamics are like without having some understanding of rulers. That's the thrust of the extension. We think that the motion doesn't commit us to defending that. We think that the motion doesn't commit us to defending that we can only look at like rulers, or that we can only look at rulers. The motion, our side of the house, all we are really saying is that we need a holistic understanding of both sides, because they are all relevant players of society, and especially in the case of oppression, they are all stakeholders in oppression. So now the second thing I'll do, and here's I think how I want you to see like most of the arguments on your flow. So there's two like models of education that have been presented. I think GovBench has mostly given you a bottom-up approach to looking at history, where we start by studying people's lives. We recognize that there is oppression in there, or that there is some unequal treatment, and then we learn about it and investigate it and think about where it might have come from. We think that there are independent harms to this model that OO hasn't addressed. So first, we think that because oppression was something that existed in these societies, that also has an effect on what historical documents and artifacts we have nowadays that are existing from those societies, right? So there's a reason why we have less works of poetry by women than we do from men. And there's a reason why we have like fewer records of things, we have fewer historical records from societies with oral traditions, because many of these indigenous societies with oral traditions were wiped out in genocides. So we think that when we have less written evidence, especially from, for example, like common women who were forced to be illiterate, then we have fewer perspectives from which to shape our analysis and understanding of those women, which therefore leads us to have a less nuanced understanding of women and draws us into stereotypes around them, right? So when we have fewer perspectives of women, then we see the few perspectives that we do have as encompassing and descriptive of all women, which leads to a worse view of history, right? So we think it's not sufficient for government to just say that, like, oh, well, learning about women is like good in general. We think we need to have a correct understanding of what those women were like, and we think that's not possible without also focusing on the leaders and how top-down structures like patriarchy were affecting their lives, because especially given the deficit of information that we might have, and understanding that the top-down structure can fill in the gaps in our knowledge. Now, the second issue is that the second issue with this with the bottom-up approach is that we think that this especially when given to young students in middle and high school, we think that this contributes to stereotypes about these people. So when OG answered my POI by saying, well, all the women in China were like marginalized, so you have to like look at their perspectives, we think that that is a result of the we think that is a harmful result, like a harmful pedagogical result of focusing on student suppression, but focusing on people's oppression, but doing so with inadequate attention to nuance or inadequate attention to sources. We need to think about who the students here are, So we think that the students here are often going to be like middle and high school students who haven't had a ton of like specific training in history yet, and therefore, and also may have like less experience doing, and also may have less experience doing historical analysis. So when you give them a very limited evidence set that they haven't when you give them a very limited evidence set and they also don't necessarily know the breadth of that evidence or what evidence exists, then they're more likely to form stereotypes internally based on the evidence that they're given in high school classes. Before my last point, I'll take opening.
Yeah, so in the status quo, people think that foot binding practices that women did in China were something that all women did, but this is something that only elite women had access to because you only study elitist women. How do you actually engage with this?
So we think that both ways of focusing on one group of people over the other is bad, right? So focusing only on elites is bad, but also focusing only on people who are not elites is also bad. We think that, again, our side of the motion doesn't commit us to studying only one or the other. We think that history and cultures are synthetic things, which means that you have to study the interplay between both groups. So now, so now the last thing I'll say. So we think that the OG mechanism of studying, like TLDR, the OO mechanism is like, we can study leaders, we just have to be critical of them. We think that's not a complete mechanism because it doesn't answer how we should be critical of these leaders. Well, we think that we think that we're the only ones here who are giving you the necessary analysis of how studying leaders isn't a study just of the leaders, but it's a study of the social dynamics that they contribute to and the social systems that they promote and how it affects common people. So we think that the only way for us to be critical is to focus on these top-down structures, because the reasons why these leaders have done bad things is because of the top-down structures that they have imposed. Okay, I think that covers me, so I'm proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We are ready to call the first whip speaker of this debate, the government whip. I'm sorry I took down my camera, but I think my connection became a little bit unstable. But yes, I'm still here. So whenever you will be ready, yes, sir.
Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I'll do 3 things in this speech. First, I'll do some kind of breaking down of the op benches case, and then specifically OO, because my rebuttal to CO will be in like the rebuilding of my case. And then I'll position our extension against our front half and tell you why CG takes this debate. Okay, so some commentary on OO's case. OO's case is largely contingent on how learning about leaders will showcase power structure, which kind of is also what CO is trying to tell you, which backs them into a corner where they believe education system is the only way to learn about the leaders and the greats. If CG can prove to you that the avenue to learn about the greats and the leaders will never cease to exist in our society, and that our education system is exclusively the most beneficial and uniquely the best way to learn about ordinary people, and there is no really other way, we win over CO and largely of we win over OO and largely of CO's case. Now, to position our extension, OG does a good job at telling us how the lensing to look at history will be changed and more people will learn about the marginalized group and thus creating a more sympathetic society and a better education system. But a couple of problems in their case. First, they don't really tell you how a more sympathetic society comes about or link out why learning history this way will play out into a better society. The only thing they tell you is marginalized people don't have to look at other sources for learning marginalized history, and the assertion without warrant that other people will also be more sympathetic. They don't really tell you why uniquely the education system do this and why it is the best way and therefore warrant the change from status quo. This problem is detrimental to their case when they don't mechanize out to you why the larger society will change and why this change wouldn't be confined to only the education system. Now, why does CG do better in this debate? Unlike OG, we characterize this effort of teaching ordinary people's histories by situating our education system and history curriculum in a unique position where we tell you that it is the best and possibly the only way for people to be as familiar with ordinary people's stories as they already are with great people's stories from pop culture and literally hundreds and thousands of stories told about Andrew Jackson, right? We saw for what the other three teams are terrified to engage with. We directly warned out to you why the prioritization of one in the education system is good and is warranted, rather than, well, what the CO first speaker just told us. Well, we still learn about it in the education system. We are going to tell you why the prioritization is warranted, and even if you take us to the extreme where the ordinary people's stories is only told in, like, where the education system only tell us about ordinary people's stories, we still win this debate in the most extreme possible form. Before that, I'll take POI from CO.
So I once watched a biopic about Winston Churchill, but I didn't really learn about why imperialism was bad. So where else am I supposed to learn that?
Watch more documentaries made about Winston Churchill, and I guess that's it. Or you didn't watch the documentary close enough. I mean, I don't really know what to tell you from your personal narrative. Okay, so let's engage with you why CG does this better. We tell you that making our history curriculum about ordinary people in our education system functions as a counterweight to fix our culture's propensity to only represent the great and the powerful. Why is other cultural revenue in status quo unable to fix the problem? Because individual representation is an easier story to tell in a capitalistic system where their contribution or impact on society is so great or overwhelming and action-packed, it is a more marketable story. Whereas individual people who did not single-handedly shape history, but when band together as a group, shape the fundamental building blocks of our society, their story is not as action-heavy, not as marketable, and as OG rightly point out, usually about less represented group that does not interest people outside of the group. So the popular culture avenue can always be used to tell the stories of the greats, but rarely by the ordinary people. So why is education system uniquely solved for this? First, we tell you education system is something everyone goes through, takes years to complete, therefore gives a way for everyone to learn about ordinary people. And we also mechanize this into other cultural revenues where movies that about like the hidden figures won't take 50 years to be actualized, when young filmmakers who learn about the stories of the ordinaries will want to make other cultural revenues more engaging with those stories that they're familiar with from their own education system. And note that this applies from everywhere in the world. There isn't a difference between China and the US when it comes to powerful figures being represented more and therefore more films being made about them, right? Understand that the empress in China, like Wu Zetian, who are represented the most in filmmaking, and regular women in China gets less represented in the same dynasty, right? Where she risen to power in a patriarchic system and played into that system, but regular women don't access the same benefit. So don't try to take COs, oh, they only talk about the first world, therefore like Gauss points don't fly. No, they have to clearly tell us why this is like different in their world, right? Okay, so now, this then also solved for ops bench idea that you don't learn about powerful figures or power structure in our world. Cultural revenues will always show us the stories of the great. It is the education system's job to counterbalance this skewed way of cultural representation. We take OG's point further by telling you why we avoid the deification of problematic figures. Then it's not just about the marginalized group, right? Or the way they're framing it is not as sophisticated as the way we tell you. The celebration of contributions to historical greats, rather, whether this great is Andrew Jackson or MLK, absent of context, means there must be the marginalization of certain groups of people. Like how the celebration of Columbus Day and the celebration of only their contributions and the telling of only their story, rather not from the Native American side, absolutely marginalize them regardless of what OO or CO tries to tell you. Even the glorification of MLK necessarily ignores the African American women who are also contributing to civil rights movement. Because this is kind of like a zero-sum game, right? Where other cultural revenue are already taken by these great figures, it is necessary for the education system to counterbalance that regardless of who the great is. And even if you don't buy this counterbalance point at all, we believe learning about people who are the victims of the power structure, like the actual Trail of Tears, like my partner tried to POI and get a ridiculous response from OO, apparently OO does not believe the stories of those who are oppressed is enough to illustrate the horrifying realities of historical power structure, which we heavily disagree with. I think rather we show you, even if you don't buy our counterbalance point, the context of history and the stories of those oppressed present a more visceral image of history and provide needed context to the presidency of Andrew Jackson and also other greats who have done the similar things, right? So this is why CG takes this debate. We show you uniquely why this change is warranted and why it is needed and why this is a zero-sum game when it comes to representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very fine speech. And now we are before the last speech of this debate, and we will happy to invite the opposition whip to sum up the debate as a whole.
If people have POIs, I would prefer it if you waved in the screen or held up a piece of paper. I'll probably see that faster. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. We think that the CO comes ahead in this debate for a few reasons. First off, Megan's framing of this round was extremely unique and something that's very important when considering how all the teams interact. The motion says that history curricula should be structured around the lives of the ordinary individual. This means we just have to win that structuring history curriculum solely around the lives of ordinary individuals is bad. It's a question of focus on ordinary people versus a broader educational system, including ordinary people and leaders. The entire front half assumes a binary, and we're the only ones to actually correct that. It is logistically impossible to teach young kids about history structured around only ordinary people. Like the government has said over and over again, learning about ordinary people is extremely nuanced. That means that younger kids either A, don't really understand anything because that makes history curriculum moot point because nobody actually gets anything or gets interested in it, or B, they get a really nuanced understanding of one type of ordinary person, like all common Chinese women were super oppressed since there's just not time to learn about many different types of ordinary people. We also think that it's most likely that they'll learn about the ordinary individual in the group that has the majority of the narrative in the status quo, which is white cis het men. We think that turns the entire question of representation or getting people interested in history, which is actually what's going to have the biggest long-term impact, since it's what's going to end up getting people interested in doing further research or creating policy changes. Closing government.
We literally tell you why we win both in the case of prioritization and why we win in the most extreme case of binary. We tell you that the game of representation is zero sum, and when other cultural revenues already teach you about the great, the education system need to present a counterweight. Engage with both scenarios.
Thanks for your question. Megan points out that people are most malleable and open to new ideas when they're young, like middle and lower schoolers. By the time we're in high school or college and able to handle more nuanced stories, the ideas that we've learned through childhood are so cemented in that we're not likely to change our minds. This is basic educational psychology. The alternative is a combination where young children are taught history by making a sweep over prominent figures from big parts of history, including women, BIPOCs, and LGBTQ+ leaders, so they get a breadth of perspectives. And later on, when they're capable of handling more nuanced understandings of history, they can analyze the lives of ordinary individuals. This analysis also makes us the only team to bring up the actual way that curriculum will end up playing out, which is the most important thing since it's what actually ends up shaping the future generations. The other aspect of implementation that Megan does an amazing analysis of is the documentation we actually have access to. A model of bottom-up historical education means we never end up learning about marginalized groups without documentation, and we never learn about structures that are created that actually affect the lives of ordinary people. To bring it back to the whole natives versus Andrew Jackson example that keeps on getting brought up, we have to learn about Andrew Jackson and the colonizing tendencies of the United States government since there are little to no records of natives since they tend to have oral traditions. Opening government.
If your entire point on the asymmetries that exist with regards to documentation is true, why would you therefore not prioritize individuals who are on the ground to offset it?
Yeah, so we think that the way that history ends up getting studied is like, government actually cites this multiple times where like we look at primary sources or like diary entries and newspaper clippings. Since those kinds of things don't exist for a lot of culture, we have to look at the type of documentation that does exist. And by like, for example, studying Andrew Jackson and seeing his impact on native tribes, we end up focusing on those native tribes as well and actually covering that history instead of just sweeping over it and saying, oh, there's no documentation, I guess we just move on and don't study this part. Then we think that's what a bottom-up model does, since there are so many parts of history that we just don't have records for. We think that a big problem with OG is that, one, they seem to think that American history is the only history, and other than their 2-second answer to Megan's POI, they ignore thousands of rulers who have not been white, who existed before whiteness was an existing concept, who are women, who are not straight, etc. They have this assumption that ordinary people's history is a history of oppression, and that's totalizing to these people and is bad to teach to kids. The closing government, their entire argument is that we learn about leaders elsewhere, like movies. Their answer to the POI was terrible, and I think this misses the entire core of the debate that everyone else is having, which is, what are we supposed to learn about them? CO tells you that we should learn about the cultures of patriarchy, imperialism, etc., which are unique to learning about the actions of imperial leaders and things that we can only get in this history. Nobody in America wants to produce a movie critiquing imperialism because of the current educational structure that's in place right now. Their entire speech was a complete departure from the motion, because the motion is about curriculums, not what kind of movies we can watch and why movies are better than schools. That just doesn't make sense and doesn't engage with the crux of the debate. They also tend to fall into the trap of forgetting about leaders of marginalized communities. It was really interesting when opening government said that their form of education would look like teaching about more the leaders of marginalized groups. Again, this is a focus on leaders and idols and prominent figures, and we think that's a good thing, and that just has to be diversified. OO doesn't interact with the mechanism of how to make curriculum critical. They have an unclear approach to education. Only we flesh out a top-down approach. They don't contextualize their arguments in terms of what oppression is and what power structures are. Sorry. Next in fashion, I forget what speaker position.
It's CG.
CG, yes.
Okay. You don't believe learning about the stories of Hong Kong people being beaten up by British guards is enough to illustrate imperialism?
We think that is that's definitely a story of imperialism. We think that there are also a lot of other types of imperialism with other groups that just don't have a lot of documentation, if that's like what you were referring to, or if you're referring to the movie point, we think that movies about that are probably great, but don't have anything to do with curriculum. So at the end, we think that we will leave you with a comparative. There are two mechanisms for studying history that are presented today. OG gives a bottom-up approach where you study the people first, and then through that wonder why they've been oppressed, and then like parse out what those systems of oppression are. Whereas CO gives you a top-down approach. You study structures of oppression and the people keeping it in place, allowing people to understand how systems of oppression keep marginalized ordinary people suppressed, which is the best and most efficient way to actually learn about history of both marginalized communities and of the people keeping them down. And we are extremely proud to oppose.